Welcome, everyone, to another edition of DOCTALKs. My name is Reverend Bill Spangler-Dunning. I serve as the Regional Minister for Virginia. DOCTALKs is a ministry of the Virginia region for the whole of the church. Today, we are going to be engaged in a conversation around issues of opening our church buildings or not opening our church buildings. Just a good conversation about what it is that we need to know, share with one another. And today I've invited our General Minister and President, Reverend Terri Hord Owens, to be with us as our guest host today. And so I just want to welcome Terri to the table. Please, Terri, lead us in this conversation.
On DOCTALKs, so I just enjoy being able to be a part of the conversation most weeks. But the idea or the decision-making process for whether or not we should be opening our church facilities either for worship or in many cases letting third-party groups use those facilities has certainly been at the front of mind, and particularly as governors and mayors have begun to ease some restrictions, and in some parts of the country, depending upon, quite honestly, the politics in that part of the country, you may find more or less pressure to figure out a way to open up and go back. I issued a pastoral letter a couple of weeks ago, and there was language that referenced the fact that we don't make decisions based on economics, but we do so in love, trying to ground the whole notion of how we live our lives together, both in community and particularly within faith communities. Not so much about what we need to do for the economy, so much as prioritizing the value of human life and prioritizing our love for one another. One of our clergy colleagues accused me of saying that I was saying that churches were being greedy and by thinking about opening up, and that all people were thinking about was the offerings, and that was not my intent. There was no language in that letter that I thought could even have been construed that way. I tend not to take those things personally. That comes with the job, but it did strike me that the person had missed the whole point of what the factor is in the broader macroeconomic sense. That many of our scientists and researchers are letting us know that in some places we haven't reached the peak or the surge. In other places they have. Washington State, Sandy Messick is here. They peaked a while ago, and they were one of the first areas in the country to see the heavy caseload, et cetera. But the spirit of that letter was simply to say that in love, as we look out for one another, we have to be sure that we all kind of want to be in worship together. But the idea of making those decisions has to be grounded in, first of all, our care for one another. My office engaged our general counsel, and as we were getting lots of questions about what do we say, and if people are going to open up their church buildings, what kind of language do they use? What kinds of mitigation? What kind of liability are we liable for? And I shared some language with the College of Regional Ministers that I'll share with you now. And if people are interested in getting this, it's an open from and to, but it is language that has been reviewed in all due diligence. My middle name, I think, is Due Diligence, Terri Due Diligence Hord Owens. My staff teases me because I'm always thinking about what are the impacts of any action, both for the whole church as well as for my office. And I am always engaging our general counsel, even though he doesn't represent regions or congregations. I'm always thinking about, if a region does X, what does that mean for the whole church? If a congregation does X, what does that mean for the whole church? So these 4 points are offered in that spirit of not only what does it mean for your congregation, but what does it mean for the whole church? And the first recommendation is to simply remain vigilant, right? There are different plans in different states for opening up. I am sheltering here at home with my husband and family in the Chicago area. And the Illinois governor has a 5-stage plan that has divided the state into different regions. Chicago is probably the hardest hit because it's the densest metropolitan area, but there are some parts of the state, downstate, that are very sparsely populated, not a lot of interaction around commerce, etc. So he's looked at that kind of density and also the data in terms of how the cases are showing and what the trends are with the cases and sadly with the death, to decide what bar each region of the area has to meet. And so this point of remaining vigilant is just saying we have to pay attention to where you are in your congregation and where what the current medical situation is, what's happening with the spread, with the caseload, with the numbers of deaths, what's happening in your environment. And to also simply remain vigilant to say that if you're going to open up those facilities, you need to also be proactively duly diligent. We've all been concerned about, oh, what do we do with communion? And the guidance and what I've heard people time and time again say, both online and just reading as much about this, sitting in on webinars. My chief of staff, Lee Hall Moses, and I are like in overload on trying to learn as much as we can about this. But the notion is that you have to be duly diligent in thinking about the contact that people might have and what you'll need to do to be prepared. It goes beyond communion. It goes beyond thinking about people touching door handles. The fact that the virus is, at this point, we understand it's spread through aerosols or droplets, and that even when we speak or sing, those droplets can go far beyond the 6 feet that's recommended, which is why the face masks are so important. But what does it look like if we're, depending upon the size of your congregation and the size of your space, if you could only, for example, let certain numbers of people into the space? And what does it look like if you can't sing with that many people gathered in a building? Do you listen to tracks? How do you do communion? I've seen lots of social media conversations about the whole communion piece. How do you avoid, in other words, making sure that as few people touch the elements as possible? And I've seen some groups land on, well, maybe it's just best for everybody to bring their own. Making sure the bathroom facilities are not only clean and available, but they're constantly being cleaned and touched up. The Indiana governor has issued some guidelines for employers about the kind of cleaning and continued health screening that would be necessary. In our building where Disciple Center is, it's like a 15-story office building in downtown Indianapolis, and we're all concerned about just getting on elevators with other people. They're small. With 15 floors of people, how long is it going to take any of us to get in and out? So being vigilant, not only about what's happening in terms of the metrics in your area, but also thinking about when people are coming into that space and going out, how are you going to ensure that it remains clean, that you're thinking about cleaning down it after you've had a gathering, doing deep cleaning. My husband serves a 10,000 member congregation, a Baptist church here in Chicago. They have a facility that seats 10,000, and they are doing some broadcasts from that facility, both on Facebook and on their website. But they haven't officially announced this yet. That's why I'm not saying the name of the church, but they haven't officially announced this yet. But they're thinking that they won't be going back to in-person worship until Easter of 2021. And they have a facility that would require them to do so much work to keep everybody safe before they come in, while they were there, and clean. It would require a level of cleaning that goes beyond the normal custodial cleaning. So those are just considerations. How do you prepare the space for people to be safe and clean? And how do you social distance within the space? What does worship look like and feel like for people? And then also, how do you ensure that that building, that facility, is cleaned to receive the next gathering or next meeting. Until there is a treatment or a vaccine, or until they know more about how the virus is spread, I've seen guidance to say, oh, you no longer need to wash down your groceries, right? As long as you wash your hands after you hold them. I've seen that advice. And I've also seen, there was a report on NBC last week that said that the virus can stay on stainless steel surfaces for over 24 hours. I haven't vetted that or have a source on that, but we're constantly learning new things about this virus, which is part of the challenge. So just remaining vigilant to ensure that you're thinking about those things. Stay informed, as I said, stay with the latest expert guidance. The insurance board, if you have your coverage with the insurance board, they have some excellent stuff on their website. The CDC's guidelines continue to change. And so I think it's just always best to be informed about what those guidelines are. We're keeping our COVID-19 page on disciples.org updated. There's everything from links to the latest CDC guidelines to when regional ministers share with us information or communication that they've shared out into their regions, we're sharing that information as well. There are letters from the National Council of Churches, World Council of Churches. So ensuring that you stay informed. It's also interesting to understand not only whether or not certain things are covered by insurance in our building. We have like a communicable disease, it's I guess what do you call it? An addendum on our contract, a rider on the insurance contract. What we found out is that communicable disease, in this case, it's not preventing us from doing our work, it's just preventing how we're doing the work. So a lot of the riders in insurance impact whether or not, are impacted by whether or not you actually simply cannot function versus have to functioning in a different way. So if you have those kinds of riders on your insurance policies, you should talk with your carrier about what, if any, coverage you will have under these circumstances. Unfortunately, what we found is that we really don't, that communicable disease rider doesn't really apply to this particular situation. So remaining vigilant and paying attention to what's happening around you, staying informed, and then mitigating. Again, putting particular measures in place is, to me, that's all part of staying vigilant, to ensuring that you can minimize the risk of contact as much as you can within your worship spaces. Those of you, some of you may already be going to your sanctuaries to broadcast Facebook Live or record YouTube or whatever you're doing. And I'm sure you're already practicing the social distancing. But then multiply, again, the number of people that might be in your space. There are some of our churches that are large enough that if, in order to maintain social distancing, you wouldn't be able to allow everyone who even normally attends on a worship service. And that could apply even to a small congregation. So being sure that you can address and be prepared to be duly diligent about all the contacts, I think, is really important. And some people will find that the cost of doing that is really more than we are able to bear, depending upon how, I guess, even how anal you want to be about it. My husband's nickname for me is the fire and safety marshal in our house. So I was glad that he went along with me with all the procedures about, what we bring into the house and, hand washing and all those things. He's always teasing me because I'm just overly sensitive to all that stuff. I happen to be asthmatic, so I am not the one who's going to the grocery store. I'm not the one who's bringing in packages from outside. So, you can take part of what I say with a grain of salt, but we have populations who are more susceptible and sensitive. We have disciples. We have a lot of older people in our congregations. We used to think that children weren't getting it, and now we're hearing with this new inflammatory disease that children are apparently having some reaction to the virus, And it's not clear yet whether or not these children are actually have acquired it, or if it's simply a reaction or a post reaction, I guess, to having had the virus. So we have lots of older people who have diabetes and high blood pressure and any kind of respiratory ailment. My mother has an immune deficiency. She has to get infusions every 3 weeks to build up her immune system in her body. Her body simply doesn't make IG antibodies. She's in an assisted living facility that's on lockdown. I shudder to think at what will happen if they make decisions to open that kind of facility sooner rather than later. But mitigation has to be thinking through where all the touch points might be, and how do you try to be as safe as possible if you're going to do that. Communicating. As we communicate, being thoughtful and prayerful and pastoral about recognizing that people want to gather. That's who our gathered faith communities are. And yet the early church, we gathered in our homes. I think one of the blessings from this has come from making our own communion around our kitchen or dining room tables every week. There has been a lot of awesome stuff that's come out as a result. But however we're going to communicate about it, we need to be really clear about what the expectations are. And this is one aspect that can help. Our attorneys told us it would be very hard to, unless you do contact tracing, that would be the only way that you could really determine whether someone got the virus in your space. And I know that we got a lot of questions about, well, are we liable if we open our doors and someone gets the virus at church? You would need to ensure that you not only had these mitigation procedures in place, that's where the due diligence comes in, but that you communicate that if people are coming to worship, here are the rules, here are the guidelines. You must wear masks, you must sit so many feet apart, there's going to be no singing, this is how we're going to do communion. Whatever your measures are, whatever your precautions are, you need to be sure that those are publicized well ahead of time, but also as people are entering into the space. If you just need to be sure that you're communicating clearly, and that's particularly true, they advised, when you're talking about letting third parties use the building. That they usually, we nested another congregation at the congregation I pastored, and we required that they had their own liability insurance as part of the covenant with them. But if you're going to let another third party group use your space, you really need to be sure that they have that kind of insurance, but also that you are communicating to them what your rules are for using the space, so that you can say that you were duly diligent about informing them what your expectations were for using the space. And I think I just covered the third party. So remaining vigilant, staying informed, mitigate, communicate, and be sure that you have a clear understanding with your third parties. All that said, let me go on record. Let me be very clear. I personally, and as someone else reminded me, I can't tell them what to do. I get that. But I just personally want people to know that I am on the farthest, most conservative end of this decision matrix as you can possibly get. I just don't think we're not looking at even trying to go back to our office building until probably sometime in August, if then. And a lot of that depends upon the mitigation and the due diligence that our landlord will be taking with the building. We're looking at possibly another surge, the medical experts are telling us, in the fall. As I look at the data and continue to look at what people are projecting, I would just be very, very hesitant to return to in-person worship anytime soon. I don't know that and now they're trying to put out the data to say that those areas that have opened up, that they're not seeing any increase in cases or deaths after 1 week, and that's all well and good. I just think that we still have to exercise the greatest of caution, because this is not the flu. This is life and death potentially, for many people. So that's where I stand on it. And you're not going to see me encouraging anybody to go back to in-person worship anytime soon. And I recognize that there are different pressures and different thoughts about that across the country. If you are going to do it, you need to be exercising the greatest of caution, and you need to be prepared to go above and beyond to mitigate any kind of contact, and ensuring that you're cleaning often and well, that you've thought through all the places, all the opportunities that people might have to get too close. And there really has to be, I think, a real commitment on the part of your congregation to really walk the line very carefully to ensure that everyone is focused on keeping people safe. I'm not sure when the broader, we've canceled all sorts of things this year. Many of our regions are having virtual assemblies. I think Oregon and Southwest Idaho had their first one this past weekend. Virginia's is coming up. The 2020 experience that was being held in July of this year with the National Convocation, Obra Hispana, and NAPAD has been postponed. We're going to be holding the administrative committee meeting of the General Board in October virtually. Many of our general ministries, almost all of them, have suspended all travel for the rest of 2020. We simply don't know what things are going to look like, and health officials are telling us that with the overlap of the flu season with a possible second wave of COVID-19, it's just really unpredictable. The University of California State University system has already indicated they will not be having class in person in the fall. Lots of school systems and universities are making that choice, but California, that's a pretty large state school system. So all around us, not just in terms of church, people are having to make tough decisions. I think it provides us an opportunity, though, and then I'll stop and we can engage in some dialogue to ensure that we are taking advantage of all the things that we're learning. Whenever we return to some greater level of personal interaction, because we're not going to go back to the way it was, that we have new sets of tools in our toolkit. Think about the people perhaps that are joining you in worship online that maybe wouldn't walk through your physical doors. The kinds of relationships, and there's a different kind of intimacy. There's fatigue associated with Zoom. Trust me, I spend most of my day on Zoom. There is fatigue. I'm physically more exhausted than when I was traveling a lot. It's just crazy, but my brain is fried, at the end of the day, and I have to take different kinds of breaks. But there's a certain level of, small group intimacy. I hope that we're taking from this time lessons learned in how to reach out to one another, and how to reach out to a generation for whom this is their native language. They are used to communicating on social media and reaching out in that kind of way and being creative about how they do that. And so we're learning a lot of important lessons. Many churches are now doing online giving that had really kind of been hesitant to do that before. That's one practical aspect of this, that we need to be talking and teaching about stewardship in really powerful ways. I've tried not to do too much of that in my weekly videos, but I probably will say something about that in the coming weeks, that one of the best ways to keep our churches strong is to continue to give so that you can do all the ministry that you need to do. And that's one of the most important things about that Malachi 3:10 scripture that says, bring all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in the house. And if we have meat in the house, we can help our communities, we can help those who are members of our congregations. And perhaps it's been more important and more visible now how much the general ministries do for all of our congregations in recent weeks, as you've seen them create new programs, doing things that they've never done before. Week of Compassion, NBA, Church Extension, the Pension Fund. Everybody is really trying to collaborate and be cooperative to help meet the needs of our clergy, our congregations, and the communities that we serve. So I will just leave it there, but you should know I'm not a big fan for returning just yet. I think it's too soon. And if you were to ask me to weigh in one way or the other, I would say we still need to wait and be vigilant. We need to be thinking about what it would look like when we return, but I'm not advising anybody to just rush back into in-person worship. So with that, I'll turn back the floor.
Thank you very much. As regional minister of Virginia, I hear across the churches just the struggle during this time. One, keeping people safe. Two, people are experiencing also just being all closed up. What do we do? Mental health for our people. There's also the issue of these are real people who sometimes are losing their businesses or aren't getting paid during this time and are struggling to find food. And so this conversation came up last week simply because there's a pastoral concern here as well. As regional minister, I just felt that we should have this conversation. And so I invite questions, concerns, stories. Sometimes it's just helpful even to share your own story. So I invite you to do that. Simply raise your hand in any way and I'll call upon you and let's see where the conversation goes. John, go ahead.
Well, I just want to make a comment about the potential for division in our congregations that's going to rise up. I think leaders need to see and respect the potential for that. Let me just give you a brief example. We had one of our very fine pastors who was trying to be helpful to his congregation by describing to them the ways that it will change when they do return to worship. And here in Alabama, a lot of people are returning to things. And so he made this wonderful video and he walked them through the facility and showed them that there's going to be tables that are separated for worship instead of the seats they'd been used to. He took them to the bathroom area and talked about the protocol for one person at a time in the bathroom. On and on. He told the different exits that you would take depending on where you were sitting. Well, this wonderful video that he put a link to it on their weekly newsletter created all kinds of conflict because there was a fair amount of congregational members who had anxiety that this means we're about to return. And they really arched their back against that. And that's not what he was trying to say, but what it said to me was we need to be very careful that as leaders, we bring other leaders with us and don't get ahead of the leadership of the church. I just want to make that comment. The potential for division is going to rise up, and we need to see it coming.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a very important point, John. And I got perhaps more when the pastoral letter went out, and it was accompanied that week by most of the regional ministers issuing their own letters. I got a few negative comments online, but they were very, very negative, and I would say to the point of nasty in terms of how, although that I don't like using that word, but just really personally attacking. And on the other hand, there were so many pastors who said, thank you for giving me a place to stand so that I don't have to stand in that place alone. And as disciples, we're always in a space where we're trying to make room for different points of view and trying to walk, kind of, I heard one theologian describe it as, disciples kind of come together and we talk and we discern and we hear from the Holy Spirit, and then we kind of let the theological chips fall where they may. And so we're people who try to live that way, right? But this is something that's so visceral. And it is, I've seen it fall really hard on both sides of the line, but I think the awareness of the division, and yet we also have pastors where people are pushing them to change and go back, and those pastors are not necessarily comfortable with that either. But really excellent observation.
Thank you. Eugene was next.
Yeah, I was just wanted to say that the planning committee for our assembly will be meeting this evening by way of Zoom to discuss us going to a Zoom regional assembly. We had postponed it from May 2nd to August 8th. And August 8th seems questionable even at this point here in Michigan. So we're going to be looking tonight to consider very seriously doing our assembly on Zoom. And Kathy has graciously volunteered to let us learn from her experience over this past weekend. So we'll be moving in that direction. And the regional office in Michigan is closed until further notice. Going to have it deep cleaned and sanitized and remain closed, nobody coming in, because as Terry mentioned, I mean, just the effort to maintain it with even maybe 1 or 2 people coming in is just a lot. So it's going to remain closed, and we are going to continue to recommend that services be done virtually until things get better.
Thank you, Eugene. Other questions, concerns, stories? Again, this is what this. Go ahead. Your mic goes off. Try again, Michael.
Okay, now I'm serving a small congregation in a rural area, and they have members who are thinking and wanting to go back into the sanctuary. We had an 1.5 hour meeting on Thursday night on discussing this. We had written up guidelines as far as what we will do, limiting access to our building. The only part that would be open would be the sanctuary hall going to 2 bathrooms, and that would be it. The rest would be off limits. We have seating for about 150 to 200. Our average attendance is about 50 to 60, which would be under the 50% Virginia governor guideline. I roped off every other pew to separate people. We had individuals come in and do a thorough cleaning ahead of time. Also, I think it's important for me to point out, in my county, we've been blessed. There's only been 30 cases and only 1 death in the county. And so we've truly been blessed here, and I'm thankful for that. But and we had been doing services online through our Facebook page. Well, by the end of the meeting, we decided to have basically 3 forms of worship. We would can have the inside for those who desired to come. We would video that, so it would be live Facebook. And we've had 2 drive-in services. We had one Mother's Day and had 45 present for it. And so this past Sunday, we had the inside service at 9:45. We moved it up an hour. We had our drive-in service at 10:45 outside, and the 9:45 service was recorded, and our pianist played 1 verse of the songs, but no singing. Individuals wore masks. As people were coming in, we had greeters with hand sanitizer, so people hand sanitize their hands as they entered, They were wearing masks. They were 6 feet apart, except for families who had been together. We had 21 inside. We had the outside service, and we had 29 for that service. So that is, and then this week our cleaning crew will come in and re-clean the sanctuary and everything. Also, so the people weren't handling doorknobs and everything. They were opened by me at the beginning, and they were left open for the service. So people were not having contact, and because the length of the service is shortened because people brought their own communion for offering. We just had the offering plate set by the door so people could drop it in, and there was no passing of the offering plate. And then the money was collected and given to the treasurer. So that's just how we happen to do it. And it might give some ideas to some others.
Thank you, Michael, for your story. Other questions, concerns, conversation, stories?
I think that, if I may, Bill, sorry, I just jumped in. One of the things I think would help for us to think about is dealing with the conflict that is going to come. You know, we are all aware we live in a very, 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 very tense, anxiety-driven society with some pretty sharp divides in all kinds of ways, but so much of it comes from, you know, where we get our information, where we get our news, you know, to where you can listen to somebody's opinion on this and know whether they listen to CNN or listen to Fox or listen to NPR. You know, you can almost tell by listening to them to talk for 30 seconds where they get their news. So, you know, I recently, my message to Arizona congregations has been largely what Terry's has been to our denomination. And I've shared that most of the regional ministers around the country, most of the, you know, judicatory heads in Arizona are all on the same page. And I got my first nasty letter a day or two ago from a church member that just repeated several pretty familiar talking points. You know, and so trying to think about how we are disciples. You know, those of us, I mean, I think that really value disciples for being able to love each other in the midst of disagreement are less likely to express intense, passionate distrust and name calling of the people that disagree with us on this. And other people that don't seem to understand, and this is my bias, obviously, that don't seem to understand disciple ethos are taking pot shots and pointing fingers and accusing and writing nasty things. And, you know, so how do we provide, in ways it's a teachable moment in terms of thinking about, you know, the elders in our congregations, the board members of our congregations, our pastors. How do we provide what, you know, Friedman and Steinke would call, you know, calm leadership in a time of anxiety? How do we listen and model that? And I guess everything that we've ever been taught about those things is what we just keep doing. I just haven't heard a whole lot of conversation about that. So I'm raising that as an issue of things that I'm thinking about, you know, more than just all the do's and don'ts and how we do it, but thinking about our systems and how we process decision making, how we process difference. You know, on my end, you know, I've been saying, you know, look, you obviously in disciple polity are free to do whatever you choose to do as a congregation. That's how we work. You know, what I'm sharing here is what our general minister and president says, what all the College of Regional Ministers have said, and what all the other bishops in Arizona have said, you know, which is that we think it's going to be a while before it's safe, you know, but we're happy to have conversation about it. And, you know, what came back to me was this letter of, you know, I've never known the disciples to take such a domineering stance and tell us what we can or can't believe or can or can't do. And I'm like, how did you get that out of what I said? I don't know.
Thank you, Jay. That is definitely a part of this conversation. So I love disciples for that. You find out which ones. There's times when I'm both asked to give a absolute answer and a request not to ever have an answer. But I love disciples because of our ability to disagree. I think we're one of the richest faith groups out there because we can do this if we get it right. And I think this is a moment and a situation that is testing that as who we are as disciples. Other conversations, comments, stories. Yep. Again, prayers as the power is off at my house, and my system is starting to cause problems. I may have to pass the host back. So, others.
You know, Jay, speaking to that topic of just, you know, how we manage conflict and have conversations, we're creating a new subcommittee on the administrative committee of the general board. That group is usually the one who leads small group conversations during general board meeting, and one important role they have is doing small group conversations around resolutions, right? So we've got a group in our church rethinking that whole process and looking at a lot of other things. But this small group, we're reading a book called Crucial Conversations by Terri Patterson. And he defines crucial conversations where we have issues when we have strong opinions, strong emotions, and high stakes. And when all those things are present, then it becomes even more critical that we find ways to ensure that we are all adults in the room, and not just one adult, but that we're all adults in the room. And I think it requires us to really live into who we say we are. But the reality is that these decisions are being made in such a time that's fraught with anxiety and great emotion. And I can't remember in my lifetime where there has been, I'm sure nobody on this call, unless you were here for the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. I worked for the University of Chicago Medical Centers as a special assistant to the CEO during the whole SARS epidemic. It was right before I went to the divinity school. So I know the kinds of things that hospitals and other healthcare entities do to try to mitigate and plan for these things. And there's just high stress. When it comes to our churches, there's high emotion because we want to be together and we love being together, and it's an important part of our life. And I hope that this is also a time when we as disciples can you know, pause and breathe and ensure that the way in which we're dealing with each other, it comes from a place of love, which is not the same thing as like. The love of God supersedes whether we like things or whether we want things. And I think that ability to have difficult conversations is one that we're hopefully, at least in some of the decision-making elements at the general church level, are trying to help ourselves be better at having those conversations. And perhaps the practice that you all are having and thinking through with your congregations, how you make these decisions will bear good fruit along those lines. But that's a great book that I recommend, Crucial Conversation by Terri Patterson, if you're looking for a methodology or approach. Again, to talk about things where there are high stakes, strong emotions, and pretty strong opinions, which we know disciples have strong opinions in many cases. So, and we don't all think alike about a great many things, not just this.
Terri, could I ask you to go ahead and continue as host, as my my power is running low on this side?
Host. Okay. How did I? Okay, great. Any other thoughts or stories that you want to share? Our friend Doru, is that your screen name? Where are you from again?
It's Doe Run Christian Church in Rocky Mount, Virginia.
Oh, Rocky Mount, Virginia. Okay.
30 miles south of Roanoke.
Okay.
It's a rural area. The factories in the area have continued working, and everything. And we did discuss, you know, concerns, and we said, no, we didn't want to force people to enter. That was part of our discussion. And that's where the drive-in service being continued and also the videos being continued. And we're going to do it for the next 2 weeks and, you know, talk about it again in June, depending on how our area is doing and how the state's doing.
Well, thank you for sharing what you're doing.
And
I'm curious to, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, and I understand in other areas some of the issues because, you know, in Northern Virginia, down in the Tidewater area of Virginia, in the Richmond area, there have been, you know, hundreds and thousands of cases. And their situation, I believe, is entirely different from ours. We don't have a lot of people traveling in and out of the area like you do in those types of situations. So it's a local economy, basically, and local industry, hospitals, things like that.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I'm wondering if any of you are continuing community services, you know, if you're having to think through how you're doing certain kinds of ministry to the community. I've heard of a few churches here in the Chicago area that are still doing food giveaways and things like that. They've just had to make it sort of an outside event and have boxes ready to just sort of hand off by gloved people and try to minimize the contact. But I know that NBA has given grants to lots of churches to help them continue those kinds of ministry. So I'm wondering if how some of you are dealing with those sorts of things. If that's relevant to where you are.
Hi, Terry. I'm in Olympia, Washington, and our building is closed. Our office is closed, and of course, we're not doing services, but the building is still in full use. We've turned it over to our the shelter. We have a shelter that normally uses our basement. And so as soon as the stay home order went into effect, we opened the building for them to have access to it 24/7, and they could go upstairs so they could move out of the shelter and do cleaning at certain deep cleaning on a daily basis, and have a little extra room. And it has been actually for us fairly easy. It doesn't, because the shelter has a staff that's really dedicated, and they were able to amp that up. So it's just been a few extra precautions for me as I need to go in and out of the building occasionally. But we've been able to manage that really well. We just basically have turned the building over, and when we're ready to come back, we'll deal with that.
Okay. Amanda put in the chat that their food pantry has been converted to drive-through, and she's in Hillsville, mountains of Southwest Virginia, and they're also doing hot meal delivery with volunteers who feel okay just delivering a box meal to somebody's door. So that's awesome stuff. Any other stories, concerns, or? Ms. Gonzalez, I can't see your first name.
Hi, yeah. My name is Lisa Gonzalez. I am the Director of Loss Control at Insurance Board. I just wanted to make a comment and say thank you to all of you for giving it such thoughtful consideration. I think I echo your sentiments in terms of making it's a whole new way of thinking, the new reality that we're living in, and in order to make sure that we're doing what you recommended, that we're making decisions in love and in safety being top priority, there's so many different things to reconsider, so many factors in every single step of just within our own households, right, as well as just going to the store, picking up our packages that may be left at the door, processing things within our own homes, let alone then when we go outside of our homes and you're talking about involving other people with other mindsets, different opinions, and the fact that right now I think there's so many different resources coming at us at one time, and from state to state, guidelines are not consistent.
Right.
So the national guidelines aren't necessarily the same as our state guidelines, which aren't also exactly the same as our local guidelines that are being adopted that are from the state. We're running into that, you know, we're actually based out of Ohio. So where they just officially are going to be opening up camps, daycares, and pools, public pools, whereas we were at total lockdown. There was nothing. So what we've been trying to urge people to do is to basically, you know, baby steps. You know, you have to crawl before you walk, before you run, before you sprint. And I think it is not very thoughtful right now. For example, what we're doing when we were required to wear masks, and then recently our governor said, well, they're not required. And then we went from nothing to now public pools, camps, and daycares are going to be opened. And without giving people the opportunity to truly start to crawl first and come out into, because there's so many different things to consider. So at IB, originally we were suggesting that if people are going to start opening up, consider maybe opening up your just church office and day-to-day operations, because that in and of itself is a whole new way of doing things, as opposed to before you even get to worship. I feel as though worship is like a sprint. And if you haven't figured out how day-to-day operations are going to be managed within the business office, and how employees are going to be managed and volunteers are going to be managed out of the business office, how are you going to receive guests? How are you going to be setting things up to discourage too many people congregating in one area within the business office? How are you going to maintain social distancing, have proper ventilation, all of those things? So we're actually working on a piece right now to try to consider kind of 3 aspects of worship, even if people are going to move into that. These are the things that you need to do to prepare to have it. During worship itself, what are some things that people need to consider? And then after worship, you know, trying to break it up according to those different areas to offer very specific considerations just to think about, because I think that's going to be the most helpful, because there really is so much to consider. In terms of some good suggestions that I've heard regarding returning to worship, I've heard people make suggestions about actually having people sign up online and offering different, maybe not offering worship on Sunday, offering it during different times during the week to be able to accommodate people safely. And then actually having place cards at a particular pew or, you know, seats where people know exactly where they're going to be going, and that's mapped out. Posting signage, like I think someone had mentioned that, stating these are our rules. Even coming into the church office, this is what we're going, these are our protocols, this is what we're following, and this is what we're going to be requiring of everyone in order to participate. But in terms of the liability piece of that, the most important thing is whatever guidelines and protocols that you set, that they are followed. Because there is an indefensibility of setting guidelines and protocols and procedures and then not following them. That's when people can really run into trouble. So I hope, you know, I've also seen regarding communion recently, someone shared in nursing homes. Apparently there are these I'm sure you may know what they are, these packaged hosts and wine for individuals that can be, passed, or having someone can just take one and move on, or they could be sitting at their actual pew. So I thought that was actually something that could be potentially a good suggestion, providing there's like a trash receptacle that they may be placed in after people are done with them when they're on their way out. So I hope that is helpful, and we are going to continue to provide as many resources as we can, and we're committed to being there for all of our churches as we move forward and navigating this together.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And we have all been sharing the insurance board's guidelines and that webpage. So thank you for that, further helpful notes about things to be thinking about. That's that due diligence, right? If you're going to have guidelines, be sure that you're following them. Be sure that you've communicated to anyone who's entering and using your building, to be sure that everyone understands exactly what those guidelines are, and then follow them. That's very helpful. I think we're just almost 2 minutes away. Should we close up at this point? Bill, are you?
Yeah,
Oh, we did.
go
We
ahead.
did have something in the chat from Chris Morton, who mentions the Media Matters podcast called Tales of Two Cities. It was comparing Seattle and New York City, not to point fingers or blame, but one of the insights was how one governor followed the Obama pandemic guidebook and the other did not. So this is the Media Matters podcast, Tales of Two Cities, about the differences between what happened in Seattle versus New York. And then Jim is also telling us in Henry County, the Community Fellowship has partnered with Grace Network and Harvest Foundation in Virginia to give food boxes once a week to everyone in need. And they've encouraged their church to help with that. And there's a note there. And Bill, are you going to share these, the chat notes? I think there's some, Chris Morton is sharing something that happening in Nebraska. And his thoughts as things are opening up, and encouraging people not to open up too quickly. But again, there are states where the restrictions have been eased, and there's not a lot of data as to what impact that's happening.
Yep, I'll be sure to copy those notes. And
Yeah.
again, for everyone, and particularly for those in Virginia, I know as one regional minister, as I've told you recently, and no matter what, I will continue to serve you as I know you serve the people that you cared about. Your disciples, we always agree, but you're regional minister no matter what. And I believe in. Love you. And stay safe. Thank you all for the conversation. And
Thank you all.
thank you all very much. Look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks. Take care, everybody.